Okay, well, let's get started. Welcome to Messy Conversations. I'm David Tripp at the faculty at the Antioch, Los Angeles campus, and I will be, I guess, hosting, emceeing today's session. Also, welcome to February and Black History Month, and so this is a great way to start off that month. A couple of announcements as we get settled. If you're interested in protecting your privacy, we're going to start announcing this each week. But you can turn off your camera, and you can also change your name to a nickname or something. My sense is that when because these are recorded, and so if you don't want to be associated with the recording, that's a way to protect your privacy. When I look at the recordings, it seems like only the people who are talking show up, but still, if you want to be extra careful for whatever reason and protect your privacy, we recommend turn off your video and change your name to a nickname. Also, a reminder that the Messy Conversation Book Club is reading Wilkerson's Cast this week, this quarter, this winter. So, and we'll be discussing that on the 22nd. So that's only a few weeks away. So if you haven't purchased your copy of Cast, we encourage you to maybe check out Esselwan Books as a great place, a local Black-owned bookstore, independent bookstore, as a great way to get that, or borrow it from a library. Read through it as you can, and then join us on the 22nd when Elaine Parker Gills and Kirsten Grimstead will be our conversationalists around that. And Sara Beth has put that in the chat. So check that out. And then also next Monday, our conversation will be between Mihi Hyun, one of the undergraduate studies co-chairs in Los Angeles, and Kirsten Grimstead, the other undergraduate studies co-chair in Los Angeles, and myself. And we all teach sections of our program's Educational Foundations course, which deals with a lot of issues around identity and representation and diversity. And it's a required course for all incoming students. And so we thought we would highlight what we do in that course and try to connect that with what we're trying to do in Messy Conversations. So that'll be next Monday at 4. I think that's all the announcements that I have. Today, we're very, very glad to have Dr. Donald Grant join us to talk about intergenerational, transgenerational racial trauma. And I want to mention 2 books because he's prolific. I was aware of him through his 2019 book, Black Men, Intergenerational Colonialism and Behavioral Health. And then he let me know that just this week, I think the release date is today or tomorrow, he has a brand new book out called A Moon for Us All. So that's fortuitous as well. We're happy to welcome Dr. Grant. And I should say this in terms of protocol. Dr. Grant and I will be in conversation for 20-25 minutes, mostly about his book, and then we'll open it up to expand the conversation to anyone who wants to participate. One way to make sure that you participate is to put a question or a topic that you'd like to discuss in the chat. And I forget who's going to be monitoring the chat and bringing those questions to us, but one of us will be doing, I guess Sarah Beth is going to do that. So one of us will be doing that, and we'll make sure that we get to your questions and topics in the second half of our time together. So with that, again, welcome, Dr. Grant. And I got a couple of questions for you to get us started, if you're ready. You want to say hi to everybody first?
Hey, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. I'm Donald Grant. I join you from Los Angeles. I know that you all are spread in a variety of places. And I actually did my studies when I was deciding to be a licensed clinician. I had courses at Antioch for my EPPP test that was being housed there that I failed 4 times. And that's when the universe told me that it's not meant for you to be a practicing clinician. I also learned that from practicing with LA County Department of Mental Health, but I'll fill some of those boxes in as we talk today. But it's a pleasure to be here with you all today. And again, I love the platform, Messy Conversations. It's wonderful.
Terrific. Well, we're so glad to have you. So to me, this is not only an interesting book, it's sort of a wildly ambitious book in some good ways, I think. And your book explores historical risk factors that negatively affect the psychological well-being, the physical well-being, overall well-being of Black men in the industrialized West. And I wonder if you could briefly, I know it's hard, but briefly sort of give us an overview of the argument that you're making in your book.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. And, this grew out of my doctoral research back at California School of Professional Psychology, which is now Alliant University, back in 2003 when I was working on my doctoral degree, and I finished in 2007, and I was looking at adolescent boys. And then right after I finished graduate school, I ran a homeless program in El Monte, and then I began working for LA County Department of Mental Health, overseeing a small portion of foster care. And what I began to realize, and I had been a public school teacher prior to that, my bachelor's degree is in biology, and there's nothing you can do with a biology degree besides teach middle school science at the bachelor's level. And so what I began to realize is that there were so many silos associated with marginalization, meaning that when you look at groups who are isolated or groups who are underserved or under-resourced, they get services for this thing over here. They get services for this thing over here. Many of them don't have full primary care physicians that can kind of circle all the wagons. And I began to notice the risk factors associated with each individual setting and came up with this kind of philosophy of synergy, indicating that, when this happens in situation A and this happens in situation B, the sum total of those are greater than their individual parts. And so when I looked at the ecology in which Black families in general, although my focus was specifically on Black men, a lot of what I'm talking about is applicable to Black families. Even when we talk about infant mortality rates and maternal mortality rates of Black families, Black women and children, that's still an issue for Black men and families. And so I began to see all these individual.
Oh, he is frozen up on us.
Oh.
So just so if you can hear me, Donald, you've frozen on us, and we can no longer hear you.
It might help if we turn off our videos.
He may try to re-enter.
I'm pretty sure that's the first time that's happened to us. Maybe once before.
I think I lost you guys. Am I?
Are you back?
There you are. You're back.
Are you back?
So you froze up on us, and so we started turning off our cameras to see if that would help the connection.
There's no one in my house. My son is not on the PlayStation. He's at soccer practice. My wife has no meeting, so we should be good. So I apologize for that.
No problem.
And I've been working with the Geek Squad for the last 8 months trying to get everything right with the internet. So we should be great. Otherwise, somebody's going to have a problem. And so I don't know what the last thing you heard before I froze, but the general construct was to create a cohesive lens to understand the toxins in the communities in which Black people exist. And to me, what was most noteworthy was when I began to travel the world, I would have conversations with Black men in France, in Toronto, in the UK, and it would be the same thing. And so it needed to have a global approach to kind of build cohesiveness through the diaspora, and also help these other municipalities understand that, you know, just because there were no slave plantations in London, that doesn't mean that the legacy of our enslavement is not currently impacting that land.
Terrific. Thank you. That's a wonderful overview. So, you know, one of the claims in your book is that the contemporary policies that we see, psychological testing, which I think a lot of people aren't aware of how that plays out, but in really interesting ways, school to prison pipeline and so on, that these are contemporary, these function for us in a contemporary way, similar to older policies and practices like Jim Crow, debt peonage, and so on. And so could you make some of those connections for us? How are the new policies echoing or continuations of old policies and practices?
No, I love that question as well. I think the first important note to make is that you have to think about what business continuity means, right? And so when you think about Blockbuster, for instance, how many of you remember, raise your hand if you remember walking through Blockbuster, walking down the aisles, and then you get 5 videos and you'd only watch 2 of them, you wouldn't rewind them, and so you go back with like a $40 bill, right? So early on, the digital people came to Blockbuster, I think it was Redbox, and they were like, hey, soon you're gonna be able to watch any movie that you want from your living room. So it was like, no, people are going to be walking through our aisles, arguing with their partners for the rest of their lives. This is never going to end. What happened? There's one Blockbuster left in the world because there was no business continuity model. By 1860, America was exporting over 80% of the world's cotton. And when you think about that business model, when emancipation was on its brink for the enslaved African Americans and Black Americans and Africans on this land, best believe a memo went out. Hey guys, we got a problem. We are about to lose the foundation of this new global economy that's just newly been created. And we need to do something about it. And so the reason why I do a lot of DEI work, and a lot of people just want to jump in and do implicit bias training. And it's important to have this historical context to understand the magnitude of what's happened. And so when you think about it logically from a business continuity model, over 85 to 90% of the men who had birth registries for their children in like Northwest town, this town called Lancashire in the UK, they were connected to the textile industry, which means their entire economy was girded upon this slave labor, right? And so when we talk about business continuity, and I'm saying that many of the existential experiences that Black men and women have contemporarily, they're connected to these things. And so when we think, for instance, about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, many of you are familiar with the fact that there's only one way that you can still be enslaved on this land according to that amendment, and that is if you're a criminal, if you're convicted of a crime, right? So the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was added in 1865, but in 1844, the American South and the North in some capacities started to create what we call convict leasing rules, where they could go to the prisons and lease convicts to come out and do work. We sometimes forget that the Reconstruction era was like literal Reconstruction. There were like the roads were gone, the bridges were gone. And at that same time, they created the vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws said if you look homeless, if you look disheveled, if you look unemployed, you can be arrested. That was one example of how they maintained continuity of slave labor after emancipation. And many historians demonstrate that a slave plantation in 1875, 10 years after emancipation, looked very similar to what they looked like in 1855. Here's a big difference though. When you're leasing enslaved people, you become far more murderous than you do when you own them, simply because the investment required to buy another enslaved person is so much more than leasing them. And so even though we're talking post-enslavement, we're talking about an increase in insidiousness and dehumanization of this group, which is another piece of the continuity model that we see in Hollywood, in media, in our advertisements, again, to maintain this image over time. Think about, for instance, the two-tiered system of Georgia. We were all following that. For many people, it was the first time they even knew that this runoff situation existed, right? And so what happened is, in the beginning, they used to utilize a different system, and then it started to not work out so well. There are 10 states in the US who have this two-tiered system. It was created because there would be a split vote amongst the white candidates in these times. So you'd have one Black candidate in Georgia or South Carolina or North Carolina, wherever these laws existed. The Black person would win because all the Black votes would be aggregated around that person, and the one white candidate would have, or the three white candidates would have a split. So what they did was say, okay, if nobody gets 50%, we're gonna have another election to make the determination. And what they did in Georgia was they had weighted votes that said, if you're in rural Georgia, your vote counts for 2. But if you're in urban Georgia, i.e. Atlanta, your vote will only count for 1. Once that was made unconstitutional, they adopted the two-tier system. What that said was, okay, white people, tell us who you like best. That person is then gonna go and run against the Black person, even though the Black person won in this first election. That's the definition of a business continuity model of voter suppression. It's no longer legal to say you can't vote because you're Black. And so the framers of white supremacy work hard to create new iterations of this. And I'll tell you, pay attention, because there's going to be something else that comes out in Georgia as it relates to this. Now that white supremacy understands that this two-tiered system is no longer working for them, they're going to repeal that and replace it with something else, because that's how the continuity model works.
You're getting some amens here and there.
Thank you.
Excellent. One of the things that really strikes me about your work and that I appreciate is a methodological devotion to interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary perspectives. And you dig back to 200,000 years into human history. And as you suggested earlier, also take a kind of global view of things, and not only a local United States view, but a more global view. So a couple of questions about that. One is, what did you learn about the topic by going back 200,000 years?
Well, the one thing that I really became enamored with was kind of the study of the phylogenetic language groups. I wasn't aware of that, because when you look, we always start the story of, excuse me, human development way after the Out of Africa movements. And so my impetus for going that far back was, too many people easily deny the kind of genetic origins of the human species on the continent of Africa. And so what I needed to do was to ground this book in the archaeological research that demonstrates that every human being has this connection to the continent. And I wanted to demonstrate that unequivocally, which is why I spent so much time on that, because I feel like a lot of people don't understand how those phylogenetic trees moved out. And then you hear people explaining, like they'll say, oh, well, when there were modern humans on the continent of Africa, Neanderthals ruled Europe, and people don't get that. And so I felt like telling a story in a more approachable language about both out of Africa movements, the bottlenecks, how they worked, how this group left first and this group developed here and then followed similar pathways. That was important, and that's why I went that far back. I also wanted to talk more about how our differences, our phenotypic differences came to be as a result of that movement and the mixtures and the bottlenecking. I feel like that's never a part of the discussion of white supremacy. And white supremacists are oftentimes able to use, genetic racism to talk about this. And so the more we grounded in all these disciplines, the better off we are.
Yeah.
But even just one more thing to add
Yeah.
to that, even outside of that 200,000 year history, I also wanted to provide a lens through which we could all see how European nations were compelled to engage in the slave trade. I wanted to talk about the War of the Roses. I wanted to talk about the War of 1812 here. I wanted to talk about the 100 Years' War across Europe, because those were all important factors. And I treat each nation in the book like a developing human being. And, when you're in adolescence, what you do and how you do it, I needed people to understand that. That was another reason why the history component was important for me.
Yeah, and that's, thank you for that. And it speaks to the centrality of the multidisciplinary approach for your work, and which I think is important, but clearly you do as well. And I wonder if you could, give some props to multidisciplinary views of issues and why that's important to you and why that might be important to students or scholars that want to look at these issues.
I tell you, I learned the value of multidisciplinary teams, partially from being in a variety of professions myself, like being a public school teacher, running a homeless center, working for LA County as a clinical psychologist. My current job, I work at Pacific Oaks College. In addition to running my small business, we have a Center for Community and Social Impact. I am our executive director there. The tangible praxis values is first what drew me to it. When I first began teaching, we taught on teams. And we had a science teacher, a math teacher, a social studies teacher, language arts, and we would have constructs that we would weave throughout all of our classes so that students would see, like if we were studying Egypt, like I was the science teacher, so we do science on papyrus and different things like that, and the literature in English, so on and so forth. And I saw how that worked, but I was 22 years old. I was kind of like, oh yes, this is cool, but I didn't know what I was doing. I fell in love with the multidisciplinary team model as a psychologist with LA County Department of Mental Health. I was working for initially specialized foster care, which was the county's response to a set of lawsuits that had come out related to child deaths in the child welfare system. And we had these multidisciplinary team meetings, and I can't say they were all perfect, but the spirit behind it was perfect, meaning that the family got voice and choice. They were able to bring in members of their community, whether it was their minister or whomever, to participate in this planning session for the kid. And that's when I saw the true value of it, when I saw a kid's placement potentially change because their minister was there and nobody had given the story of this kid in Sunday school or whatever the story may have been, or we didn't know the magnitude of somebody's problem. And, we got this person here saying, oh, there was a suicide attempt here, a suicide attempt there, and one there. But everybody thought there was just one until we got everybody at the table to disclose the whole picture. And so for me, that's where my love for multidisciplinary teams came from. But I also wanted to deliberately illustrate the magnitude of white supremacy and its impact on Black people across the world. And if you don't demonstrate from every angle in which the system is toxified, you don't do service to the work that has to happen to fix it. And so I wanted to talk about how there's this approach throughout history to maintain this oppression and what the value of it is. Right now, I'm working on my next book. The working title is White on White Crime, Contemporary Lies or Old Lies in Contemporary Times. I don't know how many of you got to see the movie on Netflix, Hillbilly Elegy. If you haven't seen it, it is wonderful. Oh, you saw it? Oh, isn't it wonderful?
Yes.
Oh, it's such a wonderful film. They're gonna win Oscars for this movie. It's so good. But what it is, it's a story about poor white people in Appalachia. There's also a documentary and a book. And I bring that up because when we look at the intergenerational opposite of white supremacy, when we look at the intergenerational opposite of white supremacy, you know, Black subordination is that, right? And so in order to understand the perpetuation of this, we also have to understand that white men and women across the world have absorbed the lies, the fallacy of white supremacy, meaning at its most literal point, right? That white is better than other. Just think about it. In the state of California, we had to pass the Crown Act that says that you can no longer discriminate against me simply for the way my hair grows out of my head. That's a foundation of white supremacy that says, because a lot of people think white supremacy, KKK. No, white supremacy says that the way my hair grows out of my head is wrong. That's white supremacy. And so when we look at how these things are baked in, we're now at this inflection point where for the first time in American history, we see accountability for white supremacy in a way we have never before. And in order to honor that, I needed to make sure that we talked about the infractions on Black people from every discipline. People think it's only police shootings. It's not just police shootings. It's when I take my son to the doctor and I have to call myself in third person Dr. Grant in order to get the services that I need for my son to have. And I never call myself Dr. Grant. When I go to the hospital, I'm asking for things for my son. Just a quick story, David, if you don't mind. My son had severe eczema growing up. He's 11 now, so he's still not grown up. But as a young child, he had severe eczema. And my wife and I, we found this stories on social media about topical steroid withdrawal because eczema is treated heavily with topical steroids. And so we decided to take him off the steroid creams and just see how it played out. He lost like 15 to 20 pounds, but it was all aligned with what was happening to these other people. And so we're at the doctor and I say, you know, I'd like for him to get these tests, this test, this test. And the doctor is just kind of touching his stomach. And I have good insurance. This was at Cedars-Sinai. And so I say, no, that's not sufficient. Well, he seems fine. I said, he's 11 years old or he's 10 years old and he's lost 20 pounds in 6 months. The doctor looks at my son and says, have you been trying to lose weight? I said, no. That's not what we're going to do here. I began to talk about my own credentials and then asked for all these other tests again, and I was able to get them. He said, oh, you don't need a parasite test. You haven't been out of the country. I said, actually, we just spent 2 weeks in Beijing and Shanghai. And so just the assumptions of who we were. And what was worse for me is because I know I can always talk myself into a space to get what I need because I have letters behind my name. I have academic privilege. I have command of King's English privilege, if you will. But what I know is that other people who look like me would not have been able to navigate that conversation. And children are dying as a result. So it's not just police shootings, it's school systems, it's hospital systems, it's all these things. And so we have to speak about it multidisciplinarily in order to really get the proper resolution.
Thank you. It's really powerful, really powerful. And I'm very appreciative. A quick reminder to everyone, if you have questions or topics that you would like to bring into the conversation here shortly, consider putting them in the chat, and Sarah Beth is paying attention to that, and we'll get to you very shortly. I have one other question. It was a more complex question, but the pared down version of it is that you close your book by talking about and focusing on strength-based paradigms that can be used in what you call post-traumatic growth. And so I wonder if you could say a quick word about what do you mean by strength-based paradigms in that context, and maybe an example of one.
Yeah, no, great. I'm so glad you are asking to kind of unpack that a little bit. So much of the research surrounding marginalized communities is deficits based. We always talk about the things that people can't do, the deficits that we want to fix. And so, I really wanted to model for both the clinical and the social communities that there is a way to gain change and affect change, addressing problems and concerns, but also supporting strengths and resilience. And so post-traumatic growth is a construct that grew out of positive psychology and speaks to what you learn, what you gain as a result of your trauma. I was doing a trauma training in Johannesburg about 3 years ago. And it was a 5-day training, and we covered a great deal of stuff, lots of nonprofit. It was for nonprofits there serving in the townships outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. We were in this township called Alexander, and they called it Alex. It was wonderful. Young lady stood up during the presentation, told a story. I thought everybody in the room was like in their 20s or 30s or 40s, because they were all executive directors and support systems for nonprofit organizations. This girl was 15 years old. She stood up and said at 11, she became the head of household for her family when both of her parents were killed. She talked about how she started her organization, which was to deliver menstruation supplies to girls who lived around her township. She explained that when she began her menstruation, she had no idea what was going on, and she had nobody to help her through it because her parents had been gone and she was the caregiver for her 2 younger siblings. She decided that she didn't want anybody else to go through that. And when we talked about the construct of post-traumatic growth, it gave her some healing it gave her some catharsis to understand that even though we don't want to make people go through trauma, we're living in a world that's structured by which some people will go through trauma just automatically. When I'm leaving, when the world was open and I'd be leaving somewhere, I could just at night just be walking, looking at my phone while, women are walking around with their keys positioned like a knife as they walk to their car. That's not my reality. I'm aware that that is a reality, but we haven't done anything to eliminate rape culture. And so because it exists, we need to understand post-traumatic growth. When we're working with survivors of different events, whether it's racial trauma, whether it's sexual violence, intimate partner violence, we obviously want to talk about the scars. We obviously want to recognize, I'm sure many of you are familiar. I don't know where it is, so I won't look for it, but the book that says The Body Keeps the Score. Many of you in clinical work have seen that book. It's a wonderful book, and it talks about no matter how you cognitively identify traumas and stressors, your body is keeping the score. Just because you're not acknowledging it, it doesn't mean that your amygdala is not active. It doesn't mean that those cortisols are not pumping through your body and impacting your systems. And so post-traumatic growth allows us to have a different framework to see these individuals in. And what I wanted to do again was to model for different communities, different workers and quote unquote helpers, how we could approach this group, understanding the evils and the ills of the container that we're in to provide support. I need clinicians to know that racism hurts, that it's trauma. And if we don't start acting like that, we're going to lose a lot.
Thank you so much. I don't want to turn it over to everybody else. I want to keep talking with you, and I hope people feel inspired to look into your work. Just so broad-reaching and important. But we do have other conversationalists for you who are going to ask you some questions. Sarah's been looking at the chat. Do you mind taking that? Sarah?
I did see one come up, Sarah, and I think it's probably at the top of your list as it relates to the sharecropping being a part of that business continuity model. And I wanted to make sure I acknowledge that that sharecropping was the interim and the co-sponsor of convict leasing. We also have to remember that hundreds of thousands of people remained enslaved, up through the 1900s. There's a case in 1920 where a family of people had remained enslaved in rural Georgia, and they didn't know that slavery had ended. So yeah, I wanted to acknowledge that sharecropping piece, Sara.
Yeah, so thank you, Clarence, for that. Also, right after that, Lisa validated what you had said, Donald, about, a new policy approach being taken in Georgia and other places. So
It's coming.
thanks for dropping that in, Lisa. Just seeing these things that you're talking about in real life is very
Can
useful.
add something to the sharecropping model?
Sure.
In the construct of sharecropping, there was a motivation to make sure that these sharecroppers never really profited. So it became a sort of enslavement. And recently, being from the South myself and having ancestry who dealt with sharecropping, one of my older cousins told me about how they would go to market with the crops. And it wasn't until later on they learned how to turn the tag. And turning the tag meant my crop is not for sale, after they realized they were only getting a micro amount of monies for the market rate that was going. So it was an intentionality to actually continue this mode of slavery in the form of sharecropping. So I just wanted to add that to what you were saying, Dr. Grant.
1,000%. That 1,000%. Those tactics that Clarence is describing, in addition to errors and judgment things where they'd say, oh, well, you owe me this much for the land, or you had this bottle of whiskey, or blah, 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 and you couldn't argue with them. Even when you think about my family would travel from Buffalo to North Carolina every Easter week drive. And I can remember, them not paying for gas with big bills because you might not get your change. Like if you paid for gas with a $50 bill and you were only filling up with $27, and if they didn't give you your change, you dare not ask. And so my great grandpa and my dad and grandparents, they would always have like $10s. $10 bills.
I did want you to address, this is a question, I guess, of sorts. I want you to talk a little bit based on the title of today's messy conversation. I was hoping you would touch a little bit on the intergenerational post-slavery trauma that some Black men may be walking around with subliminally not knowing, and it shows up in various ways.
Yeah, that's a big topic. And so intergenerational trauma, also known as historical trauma, we first found out that it was a thing in the 1960s. What happened was clinicians started to get this onslaught of children who were the children of Jewish Holocaust survivors, and they were like, well, what is this all about? What's happening here? And then that's when they realized that trauma can be passed from one generation to another, even if that subsequent generation had not actually experienced the trauma. And so Dr. Joy DeGruy wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Now, of course, it's not a DSM-5 diagnosis, but it's really, really real. And so what the theory states is that through several different mechanisms, we transfer trauma across generations. And so there's a theory on engagement styles in parenting that speaks from social learning theory, talks about modeling and how those things are modeled down. There's this video, a tragic video of this little boy playing in his yard, and the police car comes driving down the street, and he goes to hide behind the truck in his driveway because he may not have individually, interpersonally had a negative experience with police officers, but intergenerationally, the adult men who have had poor engagement have instructed him, maybe explicitly or implicitly, this is what happens and this is what you need to pay attention to. Psychodynamic theory speaks about it through enmeshment, talks about how the tensions of enmeshment and the anxiety associated with it help to pass those things down. But for me, one of the most noteworthy discoveries inside this topic of intergenerational trauma is epigenetics. now that researchers have actually defined the way that it actually impacts your DNA. Now, a lot of that research has come from the indigenous communities. Many of you are aware of the fact that when we look at the outcomes for indigenous communities across the world, whether we're talking US, Canada, Australia, wherever you might be, the outcomes related to alcoholism, substance abuse, violence, undereducation, anything you can think of is disproportionately represented in indigenous communities. The link between colonial terrorism, massacre, and genocide and their current outcomes are all connected to intergenerational trauma. Now, here's the kicker. Here's the kicker. And, you know, I hope you guys receive this. This is a messy conversation, so I'm going to go ahead and bring this up. There's no racism Olympics. Nobody is looking to win the racism Olympics. However, when we talk about individuals who have historical trauma, and if each subsequent generation of those individuals from the onset of their historical trauma, if each generation subsequent to that group is also experiencing mass in real-time trauma, that creates a synergy that is unique to many communities, particularly Black people, particularly indigenous communities. Now, we understand that the Holocaust was a horrible event in our history. And we understand that skin privilege has provided Jewish Americans with a container that's very different than Black people. Now, are Jewish people still experiencing huge amounts of discrimination, xenophobia, depending on what countries they originate from, and all sorts of things? Absolutely. I'm not minimizing that. But what I am saying is that when you take my contemporary trauma, it becomes my son's historical trauma. The unfortunate part is that because my son is only 11 years old, he will also have his own contemporary trauma as he grows into adulthood. So the reason I give that example is because historical trauma is exacerbated by contemporary terrorism. The American Psychological Association had to call the news stations to say, hey guys, can you stop showing the video of George Floyd, please? You're traumatizing our communities. Black moms and dads are seeing their kids under that knee. Black children are seeing their parents under that knee, and they're being traumatized. We need you to stop showing that. There's not a generation of black people walking this earth today who don't deal with the contemporary the historical infractions and the contemporary ones that happen in every single solitary generation of people. There's not one decade that you can't think of in American history that there hasn't been some some national hate crime. And that's the only ones that we're talking about that make national news. The everyday experiences count too. Sara, I went off road with Clarence's answer, with Clarence's question, but I knew that was going to come up anyway. So I did an executive decision to halt on the chat box for a moment to go down that road. I hope that was all right.
Yes, absolutely. I'm totally good with your decision making here.
Clarence, thank you for that question. That was a wonderful question. Thank you for that.
No, thank you for your response. You gave us a lot.
So I think the next thing I'm getting to is Patrick had an ask, which was, can you touch on how tiring that is to have to pull that out to get what you need done? And I think he's talking about the story that you mentioned with your son at the hospital. I don't know for sure. So Patrick, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm right here. How y'all doing? Good to see everyone. When he told the story about your son at the doctor, it kind of touched a nerve for me because, I'm one of the ones too. I walk around my doctor in my back pocket because you never know when you're gonna have to whip it out. But it is so tiring to have to do that, to have to anticipate because it's coming. You can kind of feel it. And so you have to, whip it out. And then there's this indignity, this embarrassment that you have to deal with after the fact. So it is tiring to have to do it. So could you elaborate on that a little more?
It is. Thank you for that, Dr. Jefferson. Thank you for that. And yeah, it is. There's a level of fatigue that comes along with race-based stress. And it's important to know that exists, right? And so when we look at all the spaces in which some people get in and they are automatically validated upon entry, many of us who exist in this space and in these spaces that have historically been reserved for white people, we have to demonstrate our success or our efficacy in that space every single time we enter, right? And so I have a guy who works for me at Pacific Oaks College, and he's a little bit older than me, but he's a white guy. And, you know, we'd walk into a room and people who didn't know him would think that he was Dr. Grant. And I'd be like, okay, here we go again. When I worked in LA County, it'd be oftentimes, oh yeah, we're looking for Dr. Grant. I'm like, yes, hello. And so that consistent lack of awareness, again, and it's grounded in white patriarchy. Again, we have to stop thinking that white supremacy is simply burning crosses. The fact that I am not automatically amongst the candidates to be Dr. Grant in a room full of people is a problem, and it's problematic. And so the burden of that is significant. Now, I'm going to add on to that question just to mention a little bit about another trope that has passed over time related to this. So how many of you guys have heard of the term drapetomania? Drapetomania. So drapetomania is the psychological diagnosis that psychologists in the 1850s would give to enslaved people who ran away. So yes, if some of you are thinking, did I just hear what I thought I heard? Yes, there was a mental disorder associated with not wanting to be enslaved. Go figure. And so individuals would be labeled as drapetomaniacs, and they would say, you must have a mental disorder because you don't want to stay enslaved. Currently, there's this thing called imposter syndrome that some of you may be familiar with. Imposter syndrome is a remodification of drapetomania. So imposter syndrome is what happens when people of a certain ethnicity or a certain cultural group end up in a position of power or wealth or success that hasn't been traditionally identified for them, right? And so let's say if you are a Black man and you're the principal of a school or you're the president of a university, whatever, and it's, you know, based on your own tier as well, but whatever it may be, there's this anxiety associated with performance in that space because you don't feel like you belong there. And what has happened is first we were told that we were crazy to not want to be enslaved. And now we've been conditioned to doubt our agency inside spaces of success, particularly white success. Again, the psychological warfare associated with self-sabotage and the creations of environments to do that. It's astounding when you think of the work that has gone in to making sure that people are scared of me. That's the easiest way to put it. Like the work that's gone on in this nation to keep people fearful of me has been huge.
Thank you for sharing that. I think I'll move to another comment that was made by Jackie. It is a great response, and if you could discuss how Black women are affected by the trauma and how and where to find solace, the historical drama that exists for women in Black ethnic backgrounds. Did you want to say more about this, Jackie?
No.
Hey, Jackie, that's a great question. And so when we look at everything that I'm talking about, again, I opened up with, you know, the book was specific to the stats about Black men. But when I unpack the stats about Black women, they're very much similar. Now, there are some unique parts of the business continuity model that look different for Black women. And so there's this guy, his name is Dr. Marion Sims. Dr. Marion Sims is the father of modern gynecology. Excuse me. Right now, we see more Black women and Black babies dying on the birthing tables than we see in any other industrialized nation in the world. What we forget to acknowledge is that Dr. Marion Sims used to rent enslaved women and practice gynecological procedures on them without anesthesia to master his process and practice for his white patients. When we talk about what Black women are experiencing as a result of white supremacy, we're talking in the same way medical infractions. We're talking about how reality TV is currently conscripted to edit women, Black women particularly, in a particular way. And when you look at the progression of Black characters in film and television, there's a strong message about this continuity model of maintaining these images. And if you were to kind of look through the catalog of Black female characters across time, and Black male characters, in my book, I review all the Black people who have won Oscars for leading roles in films. And I look at the tropes associated with what was supported and what was not. When we talk about the outcomes for Black women, we're talking about, again, look what they've done to Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams, she's superhuman. She saved the South. Now, I'm not saying any of this to minimize what Stacey Abrams did. I hear she may even be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and that'll be wonderful. Here's the thing. We promote an image of Black women being strong and disproportionately able to manage pains that they're not able to manage. What that results in is Black women in need of help not getting it. What that results in is the disproportionate number of Black trans women who are dying on the streets right now. What that results in is the Black woman who's sitting on the table at the operating in the hospital saying, "I hurt," and somebody looking at her and not believing her hurt is the same as somebody else's hurt, particularly a white woman's hurt. And I'm not, this is not conjecture. There are research from medical schools that demonstrate that doctors have a real crystallized view that Black women have a higher threshold of pain. That's part of why they're dying on birthing tables, because people aren't taking seriously the pain that they're describing. We also see a gap in Black women in roles of variety. Whenever I talk about the Real Housewives franchise, everybody says, well, all those women act a fool. I say, yes, that may be true, but all those other women have representations from other areas in media that disrupt the image that they get. There is no more Claire Huxtable on TV to demonstrate this other Black woman besides Nene Leakes. There is no other Harriet, I can't think of her name, but she was the mom on the other Black show. These shows don't exist anymore. And so when we talk about and ask about how these things have been impacting the Black woman, that's it. And let's not talk about rape culture again, because we know that the Black female body had been objectified in some of the most atrocious ways throughout the entire system of enslavement, and continues to be impacted in that same way.
I also wonder, because it's so much concentration on the physicalities. I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat as well. On the physicalities that Black women go through, and with this trauma that is generational with Black women, the psychological portion of it seems to be tenfold, then even more so than the physical. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because we are having to watch not only what we're experiencing, we have to go through that, I understand that, but also we're having to watch what's happening to our Black men, our Black sons, our Black daughters. So there's this psychological trauma that seems to be embedded, but never really accounted for, unless you get the stigmatism, of course, of being the angry Black woman, or something where people have to always translate for you exactly what you mean when it comes from an inner space that you can't really explain.
Yeah, yeah, and you literally just answered the question, and that is that additional burden that oozes out of our eyes and ears and our noses, and people see our passion and mistake it for aggression and anger and all these other things, not understanding the weight that we're experiencing, that Black women are experiencing, and looking at, we know that poverty is racialized and feminized, meaning that a disproportionate number of women of color are experiencing poverty. That also means that that disproportionate number of women experiencing poverty are also experiencing single motherhood and looking at their children die. And when we talk about that, that burden is insurmountable for people to pay attention to. People don't really want to acknowledge that. And so when we talk about race-based stress and we talk about Black women, we're talking about a severe concern that has to be addressed, and it operationalizes itself in a variety of ways, as you can imagine. We have to create targeted methods for mental health pathways, mental wellness pathways for Black women. I just watched this video earlier today. I think this happened just last week. It's a video of a 9-year-old girl, and I grew up in Buffalo, New York. I've been in Los Angeles for about 17 years. There's a video of a 9-year-old girl in Rochester, New York, her mom called the police because she was a danger to herself or others, meaning that there was some mental health concerns going on. The video shows this little girl being maced and handcuffed and thrown in the back of a police car, screaming for her father. When we talk about pathways towards mental health services, we're saying that we need to create targeted campaigns that help different groups understand that they need or could benefit from support services, whether those are groups, individual, whatever it is. And so I think, Jacqueline, a part of what we're talking about is how do we market wellness to Black women? You guys got to remember, I mean, I've been personally practicing yoga for almost 15 years, but when I would tell some of my friends, like, oh, Black people don't do yoga, this is another part of the business continuity model that identifies certain wellness practices for certain groups. And the funny thing about it is white people appropriated yoga. They didn't start it, but it looks like in this land, you know what I mean? And so when we're saying these, we have to decolonize everything we do so that people know that it's open for everyone. We have to, make it welcoming, create spaces where something for Black women is welcome. And they're like, yeah, I want to do that. That's awesome.
I'm mindful that we're almost up to the 5 o'clock mark, but I also remember David saying that you had written about psychological assessment, and I would love to hear more on that. And I think it dovetails with Isardia's comment, who is still deciding the disorders in the DSM?
Well, first we got to remember the DSM, even though I have the 5 up here, it's still a political document, right? It's still baked in with insurance language, and it's still, even when you think of the county systems that require a diagnosis specifically for reimbursement of services, we know what the DSM is all about. Even when you think about the international work to validate some of the stuff, it's a political document. So that's my first statement on testing. I'm trained in about 7 different evidence-based mental health practices, from trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy to incredible years to all these different things. I was the guy at the county who signed up for every training because I knew I wouldn't be able to pay for it on my own. So I just trained in everything. But anyway, when you look at how the origins of psychological testing began and where they landed people, I mean, there was a court case in Oakland that said you can't even use psychological testing to place Black boys inside special ed classrooms because the psychological testing that they were being given was all funneling them over there, because psychological testing are created from a very Eurocentric framework. Even, I mean, look right now, schools are getting rid of the SATs and the GREs because they're just now realizing what we've been screaming this whole time. DEI professionals have been telling them this whole time, these tests are biased. Oh, but math is universal. Not in the way you're asking those questions. Yes, 2 + 2 is universal, but not according to your test. And so when we look at the colonized ways in which we've chosen to put labels on people, we have to undo it. Now, it's the same with the police system, which is a similar framework. Now, had I been on the committee for naming that whole movement, I would not have named it defund the police, but I wasn't invited to the committee to make that decision, and I respect those who were. However, when we know that American policing was grounded and crystallized during the time where slavery was legal on this land, and that the primary job of original police officers were to bring enslaved people back to the plantation, how do we not understand that what we see today is connected to it? And that's the example that I say, if we're unwilling to at least re-examine that system based on its historical context, we're participating in the system of racism that's going to maintain itself. Same thing with psych testing. Now, I'm not talking about like when you go and you're doing a depression analysis, or you're doing a some of those basic things to find out if this is how you're feeling. Those things are oftentimes great. But the other pieces are funneling people into negative experiences, not to mention the diagnostic criteria for things like ADHD and ODD. Black children are being sent over to the conduct disorder side when they're really demonstrating trauma responses. And so the diagnostic piece, in addition to the testing, is certainly problematic.
Thank you.
So I'll jump back in real quick. Thanks, Sarah Beth, for going through the chat and raising all these questions and topics. Great conversation so far. As is our practice, we formally wrap up as close as we can to 5 o'clock, and then invite anyone who wants to hang out for another 15-20 minutes to do so. Dr. Grant has agreed to do that, hang out for a little bit longer. So this is a more informal part of the conversation. Often, in my experience, sometimes the most interesting and best part of the conversation. So wonderful to see everybody. Come back next week if you can for the Educational Foundations conversation in Messy Conversations, and then we'll switch over now to more informal conversation with Dr. Grant.
I'll just say thank you to everybody who's in the chat box who has to leave. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for your time and your attention on this. And I appreciate your kind words.
SON Books, buy the books.
That's right. Get the book.
Okay, since no one's saying anything, those books that you have behind you, you seem to have highlighted for a particular reason, and I can't see them. Can you tell me what they are besides the cat?
Can.
That's the only one.
So I'm going to start with my children's book. This is the new book that David was talking about earlier. This is a book for middle school readers and their families. It's called A Moon for Us All. And it follows Leo and his family on their way to their family reunion from Chicago, where he has a project to do, and learning about his ancestors from at least 5 generations ago. And it's set right after the pandemic with contemporary issues weaved in. Just out today. You can get it on Amazon. It's available right now. So that's the first book I have there, Jacqueline.
And what age group is that for?
Middle school and up.
Middle school and up. Okay.
Middle school and up. And if you have a sophisticated 5th grade, my son's in 6th grade. I wrote it with him in mind. But if you have a sophisticated fifth grader who's at a school that are doing some progressive work, it's not inappropriate. I don't go as far to talk about rape of slave owners and their enslaved people, but I do talk about the destruction of slavery and those pieces. And so even if I think, well, my mom, she's my mom, so she doesn't count, but she said she enjoyed it as an adult. So I think even adults would enjoy it. So that's the first book I wanted to mention. This next book right here, a lot of people are familiar with, and you guys are moving on this in your next event. So this book is amazing. Isabel Wilkerson, anything you can read by her is great. Here's the thing about Isabel as well. Her writing is very kind of approachable. She talks about a lot of heavy topics, but when you're reading it, it's really great.
Okay.
I'll just do two more. Really quickly. Black Bourgeoisie. This is a book that I picked up because it was critical. It's critical because we oftentimes only talk about the Black experience of marginalization from the impoverished standpoint. And what that does is it creates a model of Blackness where we ignore those of us who moved into certain sectors of the world and are still experiencing discrimination because we're the only Black family on our street, or our kid goes to a school where they're the only Black kid in the classroom. And so I want to make sure that those things stay top of mind as well. And I'm going to pick the last one. I'm going to cheat. I'll do two at a time. So Stamped from the Beginning, really important book. Really important book. Critical in this discussion about anti-racism. Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. And this is probably one of my favorite autobiographies of all time. Sidney Poitier's autobiography, A Measure of a Man. It's short, it's readable, it's approachable. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That'll keep people busy. Hey, Asa, I saw you have something in the chat. You want to bring that into the conversation?
Sure. Sorry, I was having some video difficulties, but yes, I was just asking, it goes back a bit to when you were mentioning epigenetics. And first, thank you. This was a really, I have like so many things written down to go look up after this. So this is a really great
talk. That.
But I was wondering about this issue and how it might inform questions around reparations or repairing wrongs from the past, and like what that how those two issues could inform each other, or if they might be at conflict in some ways. So. Yeah,
I always want to be careful with because when you think about it, my mind automatically goes to eugenics, Asa. Whenever we talk about aggregating a biological construct with a social construct, right? And so for me, the epigenetics piece is more about helping people understand the magnitude of trauma. And for just really quickly, guys, epigenetics, it doesn't mutate DNA, it kind of changes the way it functions. And so it creates these different folds that inform protein production in different ways. And so what I would not want to do, Asa, is to aggregate the epigenetic conversation, because what will happen is it will be all deficits based, and it will say, because of racism, Black people are not as good, or Black people cannot do, or Black people are unable to understand. So that's what I don't want to do, but I still want to keep it in the forefront as we talk about the elimination of racism. As it relates to reparations, I feel like that needs to be an ongoing conversation, and that, kind of like defund the police. People have come up with what they believe reparations means, and they've decided that reparations means that every Black person in the country gets a check. And that's not, for some people, that is what they feel reparations should look like. But for me, reparations are just understanding the difference between equity and equality. Equality is giving everybody the same thing. Equity is giving people what they need to be successful. And so reparations is about saying that, okay, 200 years ago, it was illegal for this group of people to know how to read. That means something. That means that when I was bussed out of my housing project community in Buffalo, New York, to my magnet school, City Honors High School, which was one of the best schools in the state, and I was returned back to my neighborhood housing project, people would say, Donald, you talk white. And I'd always respond, it's actually you speak white. No, I never said that. I'm joking. But, you know, that is a relic of kind of giving people equity, in that nobody was there to tell me, Donald, there are children who have been convinced that learning and education is reserved for white people, and that if you do that, you are less Black. We need to help boys like you understand that that's not true, and we need to help those other boys also understand that that's not true. And so for me, that's an example of what reparations looks like, is creating programs that allow us to fill the gaps associated with whatever level of oppression we're talking about.
Thank you so much. Really quickly, I was wondering, I've never heard the term white supremacy used in kind of a more broader kind of definition. I was hoping that maybe you could expand more on that, and like the significance of generalizing white supremacy to this kind of bigger frame is, I think, really important, but how you kind of came to that, and if you could expand on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, Gabriel. And it's in many ways for the reasons why you're describing and asking the question. White supremacy at its foundation is the construct that white people are better than other people, right? That's at its foundation. A part of the business continuity model has been to other white supremacy to make it seem like it's always this big event, that it's always a lynching, or it's always a cross burning, or that it's always the KKK or the Proud Boys or whomever it may be, right? And so what I want to do, because this whole concept of being anti-racist, and you know, people get so flustered by, oh, if you're not anti-racist, then you're racist. I need people to begin to be able to understand that white supremacy just doesn't exist at the level of, or the magnitude of KKK, so that we can begin addressing it and talking about how white supremacy made it such that this little 9-year-old girl got maced in the face in Rochester, New York today. She was 9 years old. And get this, the cop told her, he said, "You're acting like a child."
Yeah.
She yells, "I am a child." Now, what that's related to, the reason I bring that up, is Georgetown University. If you go to their website, in fact, you don't even have to go to their website, you can just Google the adultification of Black girls. They have this 5-minute video that describes how Black girls are adultified throughout their childhood, and how that results in the treatment of Black women today. I wish I would have thought of that, Jacqueline, when you asked that question, because that video is amazing. And so, Gabriel, I bring that up to say that most people would look at that engagement with that little girl and the police officers, and they wouldn't be quick to understand and respect how white supremacy plays out in that space. But when we look at how white supremacy has objectified the female Black body, we see little girls now being adultified in order to maintain that cadence. So that's really the reason I want to use it in that broad sense, so we can really see the everyday spaces, because most white people, they're going to church and they're engaging in what they do, and they don't believe that they're participants and complicit in white supremacy, because they don't have a hood in their closet. But when we understand it at this level, I think it creates action.
Dr. Grant, you mentioned earlier that perhaps, I don't know if it was one of your books that you've already written or that you're currently writing, about how you analyze the Black women in Hollywood who've had these particular roles. Today I had a stolen moment, and I always go to PBS in my stolen moments. And I saw, not its entirety, but there was a documentary on, I'm assuming it was 2019 that it was completed, but I believe it was called I Wish I Were Free, and it dealt with these interviews. I was going to talk to Dr. Gills about this, these interviews that around Nina Simone, Lena Horne, just countless of them. The wonderful piece was about Abby Lincoln. So much about Abby Lincoln I did not know, but their contributions to society through the civil rights movement, especially, but the way they told the story of the documentary was juxtaposing how they were used or not used in certain stereotypic roles throughout the development of Hollywood, and especially the Black exploitation period, where they either participated or refused to participate, and why they made certain sacrifices going years without working at all, like Cicely Tyson, who we just lost last week.
Yeah.
But the impact of those women making those sacrifices because they felt they had a duty to their people was an interesting underlining meaning. But not to talk, I want you to clarify what, how you're using that in your book. But I just want to throw this out there because I need this little bit of information from you or Dr. Gills. But in that documentary, they talked about, is it the Moynihan report in 1964, where they did a whole study around Black women?
Yeah, the Black family.
Black family.
The Black family, but they didn't really, okay. I need to do more research on that.
Yeah, and you'll find, Clarence, when you do more research on the Moynihan report, that you're going to get this double jointed access, where one side is going to say how great it was for the Black community, and the other side is going to say how awful it was. And it's an interesting discussion. It's almost as interesting as Du Bois versus yeah. What'd you say? What were you saying? I'm sorry.
I wasn't sure if you were saying Du Bois. Oh, I'm sorry, Clarence.
Yep. So to respond to your question, as it relates to kind of that, it's in the book that's already out, the 2019 book, and it speaks directly to what you're describing. Here in Los Angeles, I have, a few actor friends, some pretty big names, and they talk about how they chose roles in order to share their message. I had the pleasure of talking to one gentleman who had a show some 20, 30 years ago, and the show was a sitcom about an enslaved man, and he was the lead star, and he was a young actor at this time. And I asked him, I said, I remember when this came out, and I said, I couldn't believe that an actor chose to do this. And he said, the question is not about asking whether the actor needed to do this. He said, I was a 21-year-old starving man living on my neighbor's couch, trying to make my dreams come true. The question should be, why is this type of script being greenlit to be sent out to the world and hire somebody on? And so that's my first thought. My next thought is that when I look at particularly those who have been celebrated in Hollywood for their work, I analyze all that information, and for every Black man who has won an Oscar in America for supporting actor or best actor, most of them have supported a trope utilized to maintain white supremacy. So Denzel Washington in his two, Training Day, where he played a dirty cop, and then Glory, where he plays an enslaved man. Again, this is not a question of their performance. I'm just talking about the constructs for which they are awarded, right? Louis Gossett Jr. and an officer and a gentleman, hypermasculinity, all the homophobic, all those things. When you look at Morgan Freeman and $1 Million Baby, the magical Negro, and for those of you who don't understand that construct, it is a film school construct that they talk about on creating characters where the Black man or the Black woman has no other care in the world or no other priority besides advancing the white protagonist's goals. We see that with Sidney Poitier in Lilies of the Field, another Oscar-winning performance. But again, you didn't know what he loved. You didn't know what he cared about. He came in to help those nuns build that church, and then he disappeared in the middle of the night. Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost, literally the magic magical Negro. She cared not, you learned nothing about her, and she had magic powers, but literally these tropes. Now, what I did was I compared those to who did not win, but were nominated. And so you look at Denzel, nominated for Malcolm X, did not win. We look at Will Smith. People question his performance in that. We can do that. That's a different discussion. But in Muhammad Ali, nominated, no win. Don Cheadle for Hotel Rwanda, nominated, no win. We've got to remember, Hotel Rwanda was all about the story of the massacre there. But the underpinning reason on why that happened was because of British colonialism. And so we have those three examples of men. And then we also have Morgan Freeman, who played Nelson Mandela, nominated, no win. And so when you juxtapose what they were given awards for and then what they were nominated for but didn't win, these are examples of what we are highlighting, what we are supporting. Same thing with Black women in media. When we look at who's won, we got Viola Davis for The Help, I think it was. We got all these Black women who are being awarded for being maids and who are for being slaves. But who didn't win, again, Hotel Rwanda. We got Queen Latifah in Chicago. And then there was The Loving Story with Ruth Negga, which was the first Black woman to take her case to the Supreme Court. Yeah, Hattie McDaniel for that first win. So these are all the things we're saying that are a part of this model and how Hollywood plays out. Now, let's not talk about the news and commercials. When we understand that they did an assessment on all the news stories in one municipality, and then they juxtapose those to the actual criminal records of the night to that week in order to see how the news was reporting crime in the city based on the actual crime that was being committed in the city. As you can guess, the news showed a disproportionate number of Black and brown men committing crimes compared to all the crimes that were actually committed in that city. Here's the kicker. Not only did they disproportionately choose more Black men who were committing crimes in the news, again, this is compared to the actual crimes that happened in the city. They also chose to make it such that the disproportionate Black and brown men who were committing crimes against white people. I'm not making this up. This is an empirical study that literally looked at the police station crime reports, literally looked at the newscast and quantified what they shared.
I'm a news junkie, so I can bear witness. But
Yeah.
to your point about the actresses, in this documentary, Cicely Tyson talked about being attacked when she did Sounder. And to your point, she was nominated for Sounder, did not win, as you said. But she said that she was attacked by white media because they were like, well, you were affectionate to this Black man, and we just thought all you all did was had sex. We didn't know that you had real relationships and, a nurturing relationship and a loving relationship. We didn't know that. And she said, well, how many Black homes have you been in? How many Black homes do you have?
Yep.
I got a $1 million question. So I thoroughly enjoy these conversations whenever I come, but I always walk away with the same thing is, we talk about all this stuff needs to get done. And if you look at our country today, it's a sizable part of the population that is indifferent or is actively working against where we want to go, even to the highest levels of our government. And so I find myself struggling, even though my volunteer stuff, I mentor, I do all this kind of stuff, but I find myself struggling with what to do with the anger that comes from all this. And, not to let that overtake me, but it's walking around with my, 6'4", 270 frame, brother on the weekend. I mean, it's hard it's hard trying to figure out what to do with this anger, even though I'm trying to do all this positive stuff on the other side. So there's no answer to that, but it just always.
Wait, I was gonna say, when you find out, let me know.
Me too.
I think one of the important parts of that, Patrick, is acknowledging it. I feel like it's important to acknowledge the burden that marginalized people hold just for existing. I think when that is acknowledged in some ways, that's a big deal. I was working with this really big company, and you know, I had to instruct them when one of the big shootings happened. I said, you know, you need to give some people some latitude to not have to come into work today. We were all virtual, but I said, you know, you have some people on your team who who's going to be impacted by this. You know, I think just acknowledging and recognizing that it's a thing. And remember, everything has a biological basis. Stress, we experience the feeling of stress because increased cortisol molecules are flowing through our blood, right? And so we also need to talk about what we need to do to manage that. And so there are two ways that we release cortisols from our bodies: perspiration and tears. And so as a result, we have convinced Black men that crying is not okay. We have convinced Black women that they too strong to cry. Again, a part of the business continuity model that makes it such that we are handicapped from one of the most biologically foundational pieces of stress relief. So we got to sweat and we got to cry.
Yeah, I'm in the gym right now in my garage.
No, what I didn't get to mention, I know we're coming to the end of our time. I didn't get to talk briefly about the kind of other groups of color that have been used as tools of white supremacy against or for anti-Black racism. Right now, we're seeing dissension between Black and other brown communities because of the tropes of white supremacy and colorism. And so, you know, the Asian American community has been utilized in a very terrible way by white supremacists to talk about colorism and support racism in many ways. Latinx Americans, we have all been tricked in this lie of white supremacy. And as a result, we have this dissension now between one another. And it's dangerous. And I like to give the examples intra-racially of colorism to help bridge that gap. And so let's say you look at Asian American communities, we oftentimes think about the model minority stereotype, but when you actually dig into the true diversity of Asian American communities, you have the whole spread from the most successful individuals in the country to some of the most downtrodden individuals. And a lot of people don't recognize that a lot of that is based on the constructs of white supremacy and colorism, right? And so when you look at some of the highest performing Asian Americans, and notice I'm using that in quotes because I don't have time to unpack what we all mean by that, but you know what I mean. We're looking at Japanese, Chinese, and Korean Americans who exist at some of the highest ends of the totem poles for wealth acquisition, education attainment, career success, so on and so forth. However, when you look at Cambodian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, and Hmong Americans, they're at the other end of that spectrum. Cambodian Americans are experiencing some of the highest levels of school attrition. Vietnamese Americans are experiencing some of the highest degrees of substance abuse. And when you understand that those individuals are typically, stereotypically, phenotypically darker than the other groups, that's when people begin to unpack some of this stuff and begin to say, wow, I didn't realize that that was a thing. The fact that Latinx Americans have to check the box for white on the census, that means something. Yes, ethnically, they get to check Latinx or Hispanic rather, but for race, they have to pick white. That means something. And so I didn't want to miss the opportunity to mention that part. When we talk about multiple systems working in this, we also have to talk about how each of us is being used to support the fallacy of white supremacy. And again, it's falling apart now. Where white accountability is in a space that it's never been before. But this was the same thing that happened after Reconstruction. And remember, Jim Crow was waiting right around the corner when we got complacent. And so right now we see accountability. We see people losing their jobs for white supremacy. We see people losing opportunities due to their behavior. But how long lived will this be? They just stormed the Capitol. Like literally, guys, you saw it. Literally, that was white supremacy. That was white entitlement. That was a fear born from fragility. And we have to talk about it. My last thing, Dave, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on. I know
You're
it's
good. You're good.
My last thing is that we also have to, and this is going to come off weird, but hear the whole sentence. We also have to take care of white men. White men have been told a lie throughout their entire development. When you've been told a lie throughout your entire development, undoing that hurts. And so I also believe that we have to create white affinity groups for white men to be able to begin unpacking all of the foolishness that they've been taught so that they can begin to become anti-racist. If you've been told all your life that all this was true about who you are, and then suddenly you lose your job because somebody just keyed you into the fact that you were truly not superior, that's trauma. And so that's what my next book is about, the white on white crime piece, that now that we have centennials, which is the current generation just entering the workforce, the oldest centennials are entering the workforce right now. We have centennials with this generational gap where their grandparents still absorb white supremacy for the most part. And again, not actively KKK white supremacy, but internally, right? These kids are going to have this generation gap. And if we don't talk to white families about stopping these lies, they're going to have those boys in jail who's like, I only eat organic food, bring me my organic food, or why can't I get on the flight? I'm on a terrorist list. They're so surprised at the accountability for their behaviors because they've never been told that how they feel is wrong. And so I want to be, we got to do that. We have to, and that's not from my lens, that's not to help white men. It's to help dismantle racism.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I've been sitting in messy conversations since its inception, saying that, but not in such a nice and direct way. But I love it. I can't wait for the book.
Thank you.
Before you go,
we just had a session called Ask the White Guys or something similar. David finally did that for me because I just kept saying, it's about the white men, it's about the white men, it's about the white men. So thank you for white affinity groups, David. That's what we need, white affinity groups.
We already have them. We do have them.
Before you get off, what's your children's book name again? I have
A Moon for Us All. And
all right.
The title is based on the concept, the physics concept of synchronous rotation, that no matter where you are in the world, no matter what time in the world you are, everybody sees the same face of the moon. So whether you are in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1821 or in London, UK in 1995, you all saw the exact same, not just the same moon, but the exact same side of the moon. And so that's why it's titled A Moon for Us All. And these images here are the main character in Africa before he was kidnapped. That's him enslaved. That's him as a sharecropper. And that's him when he was first able to go to school to learn to read. And that's him now. And so I even called my publisher when the Capitol raid happened. I said, I need one more illustration. Please, please, please wait. I need one more illustration.
Wow. Right. Yeah. On point.
And so the family talks about the Capitol raid and they talk about white supremacy. The story of Emmett Till is told because grandpa lived down the street from his aunt and uncle when he was kidnapped. And so it's more of a narrative discussion of a Black family talking about these things. Why won't there ever be a monument to Malcolm X, but there is one to Martin Luther King? And so I'm just looking to decolonize the stories of Black America for families so that they can have messy discussions at home.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Donald. It's not somebody's dog.
Somebody's dog.
Thank you.
And I'm glad you brought up the stuff around white folk as well. I know when I first approached you and you said, yeah, I'll do that if I can talk about how this all affects the oppressor too. And so I'm glad we got that in at the very end. extraordinary job. We're so grateful to have you, and want to wish you well with your new book and the book that we were looking at today. Just stunning treatment of the issues.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is there a best get in contact with you at? There's some work I'm doing in Houston I want to reach about.
Yeah, I'll put my email address in the chat box for everyone. And David, I didn't get to say that I have beard envy.
This is pandemic, a result of the pandemic.
Well, this is 6 years of beard growth right here. This is all I get. I'm joking. I do want a full beard. I just can't grow one though. So I'm sitting here like David has this full beard. I can't even. Patrick too. Everybody has a full beard except me.
If you come more often, maybe it'll rub off on you.
Well, this was truly a pleasure, everybody. Thank you so much for your attention and your insightful questions and your willingness to be vulnerable and hear me out and be thoughtful about the discussion today. I always appreciate a space like this, and I look forward with partnering with you all soon again.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, I want to thank you too, Donald. It was a real, very enriching experience to share this with you. Each of these messy conversations has had its own dynamic, and this one took our conversation to a new level, I would say. And we will keep going, but we will, what you have said today will resonate and echo through our future conversations as well. So thank you so much. It was very, very rich.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. That means a lot.
And you're invited to my class. I'll be in touch.
And this is the first one that Asian American is actually brought into the picture. And thanks for including us, because you didn't allow me to stand by the side and watch. For the first time, you tell me is I have to do the thinking too, and I have to think about what's been involved and what's taught to me and how I should challenge and question. I mean, this is amazing, and I'm. Last time, was it last time? No, the time before, we actually had a messy conversation about Ask the White Guys. And you answer a lot of questions I have in mind. My problem is that I don't even know where to ask, but you led me. Thank you so much. This is pure enjoyment. I can tell you that. I mean, thank you.
Anna, thank you for that. Thank you for that comment. And I must say, excuse me, our Asian American brothers and sisters are oftentimes isolated from these conversations because many of them sit on the sidelines because they've been told if you bring something up, you will be marginalized now. So just enjoy your position, shut up and sit there. And so I like to empower the community to say, no, you too have a stake in this, because my liberation, your liberation, they're all grounded together. And so, Anna, I'm so appreciative of you acknowledging that with your comment, because it really means a lot to me. And that's the purpose on why I try to share other examples, right? When I talk about sexism, just in case somebody doesn't grab onto the racism thing, they're like, oh, I get that piece. Or I mention something about homophobia, just so everybody can feel and understand how they can participate. So thank you for that, Anna.
I didn't mention that I am the director of the BA program at Santa Barbara. At one point, I would love to bring in, to invite you as our speaker. So
let's do it. Let's do it. My chat's in the box. So David had to go, and we'll probably be on this forever if we don't cut it off now. So anyways, guys, you guys have my contact information. Mary Lou, were you going to say something? Go ahead. You're on mute.
No, I just really appreciated it a whole lot. It's great. And I want us to think about, what do we do next? As an institution, as teachers.
Yeah.
So But not today. We need another day for that.
All right, everybody. Such a pleasure today. I'll see
Thanks.
you all soon.
Okay, thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.